cold doesn't care about your plans. It doesn't care if you have a family waiting a debt to pay or a prayer still rattling in your throat. It just takes. When Amos found her, the cold had already taken her pride, her warmth, and the feeling in her legs. She was a ragged thing of bruised knuckles and torn calico shivering against a dead pine. She couldn't walk. She didn't have to. Winter arrived 3 weeks early in the Bitterroot Mountains. Amos Burnett felt the atmospheric shift deep within the scarred, knotted tissue of his left shoulder, long before the first flakes began to fall. He knelt beside a snaffled rabbit, the animal already stiff and grey against the frost-heaved earth. He snapped the snare wire with thick, calloused fingers. Meat was meat. He shoved the frozen carcass into his canvas sack, ignoring the biting wind that whipped down through the lodgepole pines. The sky above the tree line hung like a bruised iron slab, heavy with the promise of a blizzard that would choke the mountain pass until late May. He stood his breath pluming in the freezing air. 8 miles to the cabin. 4 hours of daylight left. A sharp, unnatural snap echoed through the heavy timber. It was not a branch breaking under the weight of snow. The sound was too hollow, too sharp. A pistol shot muffled by distance and the density of the forest. Amos adjusted his rifle sling and stood perfectly still, letting his ears map the terrain. Curiosity in the high country was a reliable way to get killed, but a gunshot meant men, and men meant trouble. Trouble had a nasty habit of bleeding into his territory if left unchecked. He altered his course, moving silently across the ridgeline, his snowshoes distributing his weight over the powdery crust. 20 minutes later, the smell of cordite and ruptured earth hit his nose. At the bottom of a steep ravine, a wrecked buckboard lay splintered against a massive granite boulder, one wheel spinning lazily on a bent iron axle. A draft horse lay tangled in the heavy leather traces, its neck broken. 2 dead men sprawled near the wreckage, half covered by drifting snow. Looked like a robbery, or an execution. Out here the line between the two was paper thin. Amos scanned the ridge, his thumb resting lightly on the cold hammer of his Winchester. Nothing moved. No birds sang. The woods held their breath. He slid down the embankment, his boots carving deep furrows in the white powder. He checked the nearest body. A clean hole through the chest. Pockets turned inside out. A rusted tin canteen lay discarded nearby. Then a raspy, wet cough broke the silence. 30 yards upstream, wedged beneath the exposed, twisting roots of a fallen spruce, sat a woman. She clutched a heavy Colt Navy revolver in 2 trembling hands, aiming the barrel vaguely at his chest. Her face was smeared with soot and dried mud. She wore a man's wool coat 3 sizes too large and reeking of dampness over a calico dress ripped entirely up the side. Her left ankle twisted outward at a sickly, unnatural angle. "Keep back," she whispered. Her voice was thin, scraping against her throat like dry leaves on gravel. Amos didn't raise his hands. He didn't speak. He just stopped and looked at the gun. The hammer was resting flat against the frame. Her fingers were mottled blue and white. She couldn't have pulled that heavy hammer back if her soul depended on it. "You're freezing," he said. His voice rumbled a sound born of profound disuse, rough and low. "I'll shoot." "Gun's empty, or you'd have shot the men who left you." He took a slow, deliberate step forward. She gritted her teeth, a fierce, feral light sparking in her dark eyes. She tried to thumb the hammer. Her thumb slipped off the knurled metal. She let out a dry, wretched sob of pure frustration, and the heavy revolver tumbled from her useless grip, plunging into a snowdrift. She slumped back against the packed dirt, the last ounce of adrenaline abandoning her body. Her chin hit her chest. Amos reached her in 3 long strides. He kicked the gun away and dropped to a crouch. Her eyes fluttered glassy and unfocused, tracking him with the lazy panic of a dying animal. "My name is Coraline," She mumbled words slurring together as hypothermia dragged her under. "Tell them, Josiah, I didn't—" "Save your breath." Amos shrugged off his heavy pack. He pulled a thick woolen blanket from the main compartment and draped it around her trembling shoulders. She barely registered the movement. She weighed next to nothing. Starved, severely dehydrated, and half frozen. The broken ankle was just the final insult to a failing body. He looked up at the sky. The iron grey was rapidly darkening to a bruised purple. The wind was picking up, biting at the exposed skin of his neck. The temperature was dropping fast. She couldn't walk. He couldn't leave her. The math was brutally simple. Amos turned his back to her, dropping to one knee in the snow. He reached back and grabbed her wrists. They felt like brittle twigs encased in ice. He pulled her forward, draping her arms over his broad shoulders. "Hold on," he muttered. He hoisted her up. She let out a sharp, breathless cry of agony as her shattered ankle jostled, then she went completely limp. Dead weight. He adjusted her on his back, crossing her forearms over his chest, gripping her wrists tightly in one massive leather-gloved hand. With his free hand, he grabbed his rifle. 8 miles, uphill. It was going to be a miserable evening. The first mile was always a liar. The body fed on adrenaline, pushing through the initial shock of the burden, convincing the mind that the task was manageable. By the 3rd mile, the truth settled into the muscles like battery acid. Amos moved with a slow, grinding rhythm. Left foot, right foot. Breathe in the razor-sharp air, exhale a cloud of steam. Coraline's weight pressed down on his lumbar spine, forcing him into a permanent hunch. She was a small woman, but unconsciousness made her heavy, her body sagging against his pack harness like a sack of wet grain. The snow began to fall in earnest just past the 4th mile marker, a jagged outcrop of black basalt that Amos used for navigation. It wasn't the gentle drifting snow of a winter evening. It was driven sideways by a howling updraft, stinging his face like thrown sand. The trail he usually took was already gone, erased by the wind. He navigated by memory and the subtle inclines of the ridge. Coraline's head lolled against his neck. Her cheek was terrifyingly cold. Every few hundred yards she would murmur in her delirium, Don't let Josiah find the ledger." She whispered, her breath tickling his collar. Amos didn't answer. He didn't care about Josiah or a ledger or whatever mess had left her broken at the bottom of a ravine. He cared about his burning quadriceps and the dull, throbbing pain radiating from his old shoulder injury. He cared about getting to the tree line before the total whiteout hit. He stopped under the meager shelter of an overhanging cliff face to catch his breath. His lungs burned, begging for oxygen in the thin mountain air. He carefully lowered her onto a flat rock, keeping her wrapped tightly in the wool blanket. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, tinged with a terrifying shade of blue. Amos took off his glove, scooped a handful of clean snow, and pressed it against his own neck until it melted into a small pool of water in his palm. He tipped her head back gently and let the water drip past her lips. She coughed, her eyelids fluttering open. For a second the glaze cleared, and she looked at him. She didn't scream. She just stared at the massive, bearded man kneeling over her, processing the brute reality of her situation. "You're a mountain man," she rasped. "Amos, you're carrying me. You can't walk. Just leave me." It wasn't a noble sacrifice. It was pure exhaustion, the profound weariness of someone who had been running for too long and finally found a good place to stop. "I'm already dead. Not on my mountain," Amos said. He didn't wait for a reply. He turned his back to her, hoisted her up again, and stepped back out into the teeth of the storm. The last 2 miles were a localized hell. The snow was up to his knees now, turning every step into a calculated exertion of force. The wind roared a deafening sound that stripped the heat from his body, despite the immense physical effort. Coraline had gone entirely silent. Amos couldn't tell if she was unconscious or dead. He couldn't stop to check. If he stopped, his muscles would lock up, the cold would sink into his marrow, and they would both become permanent fixtures of the bitter roots. He locked his mind away from the pain. He visualized the cabin. He smelled the pitch pine burning in the cast-iron stove. He felt the worn wood of the floorboards. He broke his existence down to a singular, primitive objective: reach the door. When the dark shape of the cabin finally materialized through the blinding white squall, Amos didn't feel relief. He felt nothing but a mechanical drive to finish the sequence. He trudged up the sloping porch, his boots thudding dully against the wood. He didn't have a free hand for the latch. He turned his side and kicked the heavy oak door directly next to the handle. It burst inward, protesting loudly on iron hinges. They were inside. It was entirely dark and barely warmer than the porch, but the wind was suddenly gone. Amos stood in the center of the room for a long, shuddering second, letting the utter silence wash over him before he finally let go of her wrists. Amos lowered her onto the narrow cot in the corner of the room. She didn't stir. He immediately turned to the stove. Survival in the deep winter was a sequence of operations, and warmth was always the first step. He struck a lucifer match against the brickwork, dropping the flare into a pile of dry tinder and birch bark. It caught instantly. He fed it kindling, then split logs, waiting until the iron belly of the stove began to radiate a faint, life-saving heat. He lit a kerosene lantern and hung it from a rusted nail on a roof beam. The yellow light threw long, dancing shadows across the cramped utilitarian room. He turned back to the cot. Coraline lay exactly as he had left her, a lump of snow-crusted wool and torn fabric. Amos stepped over. He had to get her out of the wet clothes, or the fire would just slow-cook the dampness right into her lungs, bringing on pneumonia. He didn't harbor any gentlemanly hesitations. Out here, modesty was a luxury that killed people. He pulled the heavy, oversized wool coat off her arms. It was soaked through and smelled of cheap whiskey and horse sweat. He dropped it on the floor. Her calico dress was ruined, stiff with frozen mud, and torn from the hem to the thigh. He moved to her feet. She was wearing men's leather boots, laced tight. The leather was frozen solid. Amos drew his hunting knife from his belt. He slid the heavy steel blade under the laces and cut them straight down the middle. He pried the stiff leather apart and pulled the boots off. Her feet were ice cold, the toes pale and waxy, frost nip bordering on deep frostbite. He didn't rub them. Rubbing damaged the frozen tissue. He filled a tin basin with water from a bucket, set it on the warming stove just long enough to take the freezing edge off, and brought it to the cot. He submerged her feet in the cool water. It had to be a slow thaw. Next was the ankle. It was swollen to the size of a grapefruit purple and angry. Amos knelt beside the bed, examining the joint. It wasn't a compound fracture. The bone hadn't broken the skin, but it was severely displaced. He needed to set it before the swelling got worse. He walked to a wooden chest at the foot of his own bed, pulling out a clean linen sheet and ripping it into long strips. He found 2 straight pieces of kindling to use as splints. He returned to Coraline. He placed one hand on her heel, the other on her shin. He took a breath, bracing himself. He pulled firmly, twisting the joint back into alignment. The loud pop echoed in the small cabin. Coraline's eyes flew open. She didn't scream. She gasped, a ragged, desperate intake of air, her back arching off the mattress. Her hands flew out blindly, clawing for a weapon, finding only the rough wool of the blanket. She scrambled backward, wedging herself into the corner of the wall, her chest heaving. "Don't touch me!" She croaked, her voice wrecked. Amos sat back on his heels, his hands resting on his thighs. He let her panic. He didn't try to shush her or offer empty comforts. He watched her chest rise and fall, watched her eyes dart around the unfamiliar room, taking in the drying pelts, The stacked firewood, the rifles on the wall, and finally the massive man kneeling beside her. "You're in my cabin," Amos said evenly. "You have a broken leg. I just set the bone. Your feet are thawing. If you thrash around, you'll undo the set and you'll walk with a limp for the rest of your life. If you even walk again." Coraline stared at him, her breathing slowly leveling out. The feral panic in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a cold, calculating awareness. She looked down at her bare legs, at the basin of water, at the splints resting on the floor. "Where are my clothes?" she demanded, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "Frozen, drying over the stove." Amos stood up. He seemed to take up half the room. "You were dying. Wet clothes speed up the process." She swallowed hard, her throat clicking. "You carried me." "I did." "Why?" Amos turned away, picking up a tin coffee pot and shaking it to check the grounds. Didn't feel like digging a grave in the frost. He set the pot on the stove. The cabin was finally warming up, the smell of wood smoke and old leather filling the space. "You're hungry," Amos stated, not a question. "I'm fine." Coraline lied smoothly. Her stomach immediately betrayed her with a loud, hollow growl. Amos ignored her pride. He walked to a small pantry shelf, pulling down a jar of preserved venison broth. He poured it into a small iron skillet to heat. Coraline watched his every move. She was trapped. She knew it, and she knew he knew it. She was entirely at the mercy of a stranger who lived like a ghost in the high mountains. "My name is Coraline Lewis," she said, her voice steadier now, though still hoarse. "Amos Burnett. I don't have any money to pay you for this, Amos Burnett." Amos stirred the broth with a wooden spoon. He didn't look back at her. Didn't ask for any. "Men always ask for something," she said, her tone dripping with a hard-earned cynicism. Amos poured the hot broth into a tin mug. He walked over and held it out to her. His eyes were pale grey, entirely unreadable, holding none of the greed or malice she was accustomed to seeing in men. "Drink," he said. "Then I'm wrapping that leg." Coraline hesitated, looking from his face to the mug. Slowly her trembling hands reached out and took the warm tin. The heat seeped into her frozen palms. She took a small sip. The rich, salty broth coated her raw throat, hitting her empty stomach like a physical blow. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping and tracking through the dirt on her cheek. Amos turned his back to give her a shred of privacy. He stared at the fire flickering in the stove grates. The storm howled outside, throwing its weight against the log walls, but the cabin held firm. She was alive. But as he listened to her quiet, shuddering breaths behind him, Amos knew the hardest part wasn't pulling her out of the snow. The hardest part was going to be figuring out what to do with her now. Morning arrived as a grey, reluctant bruise against the frosted window pane. The wind had died overnight, leaving behind a silence so absolute it rang in the ears. Amos was already awake. He sat at the small scarred table, systematically running an oiled rag over the disassembled parts of his Winchester. The rhythmic clack of metal on metal was the only sound in the cabin. Coraline woke slowly, her consciousness dragging itself out of a deep, exhausted sleep. The fire had been banked, radiating a dull, consistent heat. For a fraction of a second, she didn't know where she was. Then she tried to shift her weight, and the memory of the previous day came crashing back on a wave of white-hot agony. Her left ankle throbbed with a relentless, sick pulse. She hissed, biting down hard on her lower lip. Amos didn't look up from his rifle. "Pulsing means blood is moving. It's a good sign." "It feels like it's caught in a bear trap," she rasped. Her throat was still raw, but her voice had lost the reedy weakness of hypothermia. "I've been in a bear trap." Amos picked up the receiver, inspecting the breach. "This is better. He reassembled the rifle with practiced blind efficiency, stood, and walked to the stove. He poured a mug of black coffee and carried it over to the cot. He handed it down to her. Coraline took it, wrapping her pale fingers around the hot tin. "I need to bind it," Amos said, nodding toward her leg. "The swelling is down enough. If I leave it in just the splint, you'll roll in your sleep and snap the bone right back out of place." Coraline took a sip of the bitter, boiling coffee. It tasted like burnt earth, and it was exactly what she needed. "Do it." Amos pulled up a wooden stool. He unwrapped the temporary linen strips. The flesh was an ugly tapestry of deep violet and sickly yellow, the skin stretched tight and shiny. He took a fresh roll of canvas, stripping he had cut from an old tent. "Take a breath," he instructed. He didn't wait for her to brace herself. He gripped her foot firmly and began to wrap the canvas tight, overlapping the layers, to create a rigid cast. Coraline slammed her eyes shut. She gripped the edge of the mattress, her knuckles turning white. She didn't scream, but a low, involuntary whimper escaped her teeth. Amos worked fast. He possessed a brutal efficiency that was devoid of malice. He tied off the canvas with a thick leather thong. "Done." He stood up, putting the stool away. "Keep it elevated." He walked over to the wooden drying rack near the stove. Her oversized wool coat hung stiffly over the rungs, steaming lightly. Amos pulled it down to check the lining. A wet coat in this climate was a death sentence waiting to happen, and he needed to ensure the thick wool was dry through to the seams. As he flipped the heavy garment, a dull thud echoed against the floorboards. Something had slipped from a hidden interior tear in the lining. It was a heavy rectangular package wrapped tightly in oiled leather and bound with twine. Coraline's head snapped up. The color drained from her face, leaving her paler than she had been in the snow. "Put that down." Amos ignored her. He knelt, picking up the package. It had heft to it. He pulled the slip knot on the twine. "I said, put it down. It isn't yours." Panic edged her voice, sharp and ragged. She tried to sit up, reaching out blindly, but the sudden movement sent a spike of nausea through her stomach. She collapsed back against the wall, breathing hard. Amos unwrapped the oilskin. Inside was a thick ledger book, bound in black Moroccan leather. The cover was unmarked, worn smooth at the corners from heavy use. He flipped it open. The pages were crammed with meticulous, spidery handwriting. Columns of names, dates, and figures. He read a few lines. Sheriff Miller, $500. Freight tariffs diverted, $3,200. Land requisition forced, $1,500. At the top of the page, stamped in fading purple ink, was a name: Josiah Taggart. Amos closed the book. He looked at Coraline. She was staring at him, her chest heaving, waiting for the axe to fall. She expected anger. She expected greed. "You're a thief," Amos stated simply. "I'm an accountant." She spat back, her eyes flashing with sudden defensive fire. "Or I was, for Josiah Taggart. He runs the silver camps down in the basin. He runs the valley, the freight lines, and the law. I kept his books." "Looks like you stole his books. I took the real ones." Coraline leaned her head against the rough logs of the wall, closing her eyes. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once. "Josiah keeps 2 sets. One for the territory taxmen and this one. This one has every bribe, every stolen land deed, every murder he paid for to secure the water rights for his stamp mills. It's a noose waiting to be tied." Amos weighed the book in his hand. "So you stole a noose. I stole leverage." She opened her eyes, meeting his cold, grey stare. "I told him I wanted out. I wanted a train ticket east and enough money to disappear, or the ledger went to the federal marshals in Denver. He agreed. He sent 2 of his men with me in a buckboard to make the exchange at the railhead." She let out a bitter, hollow laugh. "Turns out Josiah didn't want to buy my silence. He just wanted to pay for the bullets." "They tried to shoot you. They tried to execute me. I grabbed the reins. The horse panicked. We went over the ravine." She looked at the heavy black book in Amos's hand. "That ledger is the only reason I'm alive. If Josiah doesn't have it, he can't risk the marshals finding it." Amos walked over and tossed the book onto her lap. It landed with a heavy final sound. "I don't care about valley politics," Amos said, turning his back to her to stir the fire. "I don't care about silver or bribes or judges. Josiah cares," Coraline warned quietly. "He won't stop looking. He can't." Amos shut the iron stove door with a sharp clang. "Then you'd better hope the snow stays deep, Coraline, because if his men come up this mountain, I won't be asking for a train ticket. Confinement breeds a peculiar kind of madness. In the high country, winter was not a season. It was a siege. The cabin was roughly 20 feet by 15, built for utility rather than comfort. After 3 weeks, the walls felt like they were inching inward. The rhythm of survival dictated their days. Amos chopped wood. He checked his trap lines within a tight 2-mile radius, returning with snowshoe hares or lean winter squirrels. He salted meat. He oiled his boots. He existed in a state of perpetual quiet motion. Coraline hated the motion. She hated it because she could not join it. She was trapped on the narrow cot, a prisoner of her own shattered ankle. The swelling had subsided, leaving behind a deep, aching stiffness, but the bone was knitting. She spent her days watching Amos. She studied the way he moved, efficient, devoid of wasted energy. He spoke very little. He didn't offer empty reassurances. He never asked about her past, and he never explained his own. He was a man who had stripped his life down to the absolute bare minimum, and Coraline found it infuriatingly opaque. She was used to men who talked too much, men who bragged, men who telegraphed their sins and their desires. Amos was a brick wall wrapped in wool and leather. By the 4th week, the enforced idleness snapped her temper. Amos was sitting by the fire, silently mending a broken snowshoe, binding with a length of gut. Coraline threw the tin cup she was holding against the far wall. It clattered loudly, spilling the last of her water. Amos didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He tied a knot, bit off the excess gut, and set the snowshoe down. "I'm going crazy," Coraline said, her voice shaking with pent-up frustration. "I sit here day after day. I can't walk. I can't help. I am staring at the same 4 logs until my eyes bleed." Amos walked over, picked up the dented tin cup, refilled it from the bucket, and set it on the small table beside her cot. "Boredom means you aren't dying," he said flatly. "I want to do something." Amos looked at her, really looked at her. Her face had lost the hollow, starved look she had when he found her. There was color in her cheeks. The feral desperation had been replaced by a fierce, stubborn pride. He walked to his wooden chest, rummaged through it, and pulled out a heavy canvas sack. He dropped it on her lap. It was heavy. "Beans," Amos said. "Sort the rocks out. If I crack a tooth on a stone this winter, I'm tossing you back in the ravine." Coraline stared at the sack, then at him. A slow, incredulous smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. It was the first time he had seen her smile. It changed her face entirely, softening the hard, cynical edges. "Yes, sir," she said softly. The next morning, Amos brought in a thick, straight branch of mountain ash. He spent 2 hours shaving it down with his hunting knife, measuring it against his own arm, adjusting the height. He padded the top fork with layers of scrap leather, nailing it down with small tacks. He brought it to her bed. A crutch. "Left side only," he ordered. "Keep your weight entirely on your right foot. You put weight on the left, it snaps again." Coraline gripped the smooth wood. She swung her legs over the edge of the cot. The floorboards were freezing. She positioned the crutch under her arm and pushed herself up. Her right leg trembled under the sudden weight. Her head spun. She swayed violently. Amos stepped forward, his massive hands hovering just inches from her shoulders, ready to catch her, but he didn't touch her. He let her find her own balance. She took a hop forward, then another. She crossed the 5 feet to the small, frosted window. It felt like walking miles. She leaned against the frame, breathing heavily, looking out at the endless expanse of white timber. "Thank you," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "Don't thank me yet," Amos said, turning back to the stove. "You still have to walk down the mountain when the thaw comes." They fell into a grudging domesticity. Coraline took over the indoor chores she could manage on one leg. She mended clothes. She kept the fire stoked. She cooked the endless supply of game broth and beans. The silence between them shifted. It was no longer the tense, wary silence of captor and captive. It was a shared, comfortable quiet. One evening, as the wind howled a long, mournful note against the roof, Coraline sat near the stove stitching a tear in Amos's spare flannel shirt. Amos was greasing his boots by the lantern light. "Why are you up here, Amos?" she asked quietly. "Men don't live at 9,000 feet in the dead of winter unless they're hiding from something." Amos paused his work. He looked at the fire for a long time. "Down in the valleys," he finally said, his voice a low rumble. "A man will smile at you, shake your hand and cut your throat for $1. He'll lie to your face and call it business." Amos picked up the grease rag again. "Up here a bear just eats you. A blizzard just freezes you. It's violent, but it's honest. I prefer honest." Coraline looked down at her hands. She thought of Josiah Taggart. She thought of the men in the buckboard men she had shared meals with, laughing as they drove her out to be executed. "I've never known an honest man," she said softly. Amos didn't reply. 2 days later, the weather broke. The sky cleared to a brilliant, painful azure. The temperature spiked just enough to soften the top layer of snow. Amos strapped on his snowshoes to check a snare line he hadn't visited in a week due to the storms. 3 miles down the southern ridge, Amos stopped dead. He crouched, slipping his rifle off his shoulder. There, cutting directly across the game trail, was a line of depressions in the snow. They were partially filled by drift, but the shape was unmistakable. They were not animal tracks. They were not snowshoe tracks. Amos brushed the loose snow away from one of the prints. The bottom layer was packed hard. It was a boot print, a square toe with the distinct aggressive crosshatch of an iron-cleated heel. Town boots. Riding boots. Someone was walking the ridgeline. Someone who had no business being up here in the deep winter. Amos stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the dense, silent timber. The honest violence of the mountain was gone. The lying, smiling violence of the valley had finally arrived. He turned and began the long trek back to the cabin. The snow was beginning to melt, but the real storm was just getting started. Amos kicked the door shut with the heel of his boot, throwing the heavy iron deadbolt into place before the wood had even settled into the frame. He didn't take off his coat. He didn't brush the snow from his shoulders. He walked directly to the window, peering through a narrow slit in the frost. Coraline looked up from the stove, the wooden spoon stalling in a pot of boiling beans. The shift in the room was absolute. The quiet domesticity of the past month shattered in a single second. Amos was no longer the silent trapper carving a crutch. The air around him practically hummed with violence. "What is it?" she asked. "Tracks, 2 miles down the south ridge." Amos turned from the window. He walked to the corner, dragging his heavy wooden chest into the center of the room. Boot prints, iron-cleated riding heels, 3 men, maybe 4, walking a grid pattern. Coraline felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. The heat from the stove suddenly felt suffocating. Josiah's men. They found the wrecked buckboard. They found the ravine. Now they're pushing up the tree line. Amos threw open the lid of the chest. He began pulling out boxes of brass cartridges, stacking them on the table. "They don't know the cabin is here, but they know how to follow a trail, and I leave tracks when I run the snares. It's just a matter of time until they cross my path and follow it to the front door." "We can run." Coraline said, grabbing her crutch. Amos paused, looking at her leg. In waist-deep snow, with a broken ankle, we wouldn't make it a mile before they ran us down. The high ground is here. We hold the cabin. He pulled a heavy, double-barreled scattergun from the bottom of the chest. He cracked the breech, inspecting the firing pins, then slid 2 brass-hulled shells into the chambers. He snapped it shut with a sharp, heavy metallic clack. He set it on the table and reached back in, withdrawing a battered but well-oiled Colt single-action army. He held it out to her handle first. Coraline stared at the heavy revolver. She remembered dropping the Colt Navy in the snow, her frozen hands unable to pull the hammer. Her hands weren't frozen now. "I don't shoot," she said softly. "I do numbers." "You did numbers for a man who kills people for water rights," Amos replied flatly. "You know how this ends if they breach that door. Take the gun." She took it. The blued steel was heavy and cold. Amos began moving methodically around the cabin. He pulled the heavy wooden shutters closed over the 2 small windows, dropping the crossbars into their iron brackets. The cabin plunged into a dim, amber twilight, lit only by the faint glow of the stove. He took a bucket of water and poured it directly over the fire. Thick, acrid steam hissed into the room. "What are you doing?" She coughed, waving the smoke away from her face. "Smoke from the chimney is a beacon. We go dark." Amos grabbed an axe and began driving iron nails into the bottom edge of the door, securing it directly to the floorboards. "When they come, they'll come quiet. They won't announce themselves. They'll try to burn us out or shoot us through the glass." The temperature in the cabin began to drop immediately. Coraline pulled her heavy wool coat tighter around her shoulders. She hobbled over to the bed, sitting on the edge, the Colt resting in her lap. "Amos," she said. He stopped hammering. He didn't turn around. "You don't have to do this. If you give them the ledger and you give them me, they might let you walk away." She hated the words as they left her mouth, but they were true. She was bringing a war to a man who had only ever tried to save her life. Amos slowly set the axe down. He turned the dim light, catching the harsh, scarred angles of his face. "I told you once," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I don't care about valley politics, but a man brings a gun to my home, he isn't asking for a ledger. He's asking for a grave. You sit tight. Keep away from the walls. Wood splinters." He grabbed his Winchester rifle and a handful of extra cartridges, sliding them into the pockets of his coat. He walked to a small hidden hatch in the roof, near the chimney stack, a ventilation flap he used for smoking meat in the summer. He pulled a wooden crate under it and climbed up, pushing the flap open just enough to see out over the snowy clearing in front of the porch. And then they waited. Waiting was a physical torment. It was worse than the cold. It was worse than the pain in her ankle. Coraline sat in the near pitch black, listening to the creak of the cabin timbers, the settling of the frost. Every snap of a twig outside sounded like a gunshot. Every gust of wind sounded like boots on the porch. Hours bled away. Her hands cramped around the grip of the revolver. She couldn't see Amos up in the rafters, but she could hear his slow, steady breathing. The breathing of a man who had spent his entire life hunting. Night fell over the bitterroots, heavy and complete. The cold inside the cabin became a living, biting thing. Then Amos's breathing stopped. Coraline held her own breath. She gripped the gun tighter. A floorboard on the front porch groaned. It was a subtle sound, barely audible over the wind, but in the absolute silence of the cabin, it was deafening. Someone was right outside the door. Wood splintered with a deafening crack. They didn't knock. A heavy iron pry bar slammed into the gap between the door and the frame. The oak shuddered, groaning against the iron deadbolt, and the nails Amos had driven into the floor. Another heavy impact hit the door, then another. They were trying to force it off the hinges. Up in the rafters, Amos didn't yell a warning. He didn't hesitate. He jammed the barrel of his Winchester through the narrow ventilation slit, angled it sharply downward towards the porch roof, and pulled the trigger. The rifle blast in the confined space was catastrophic. Coraline's ears instantly rang with a high, piercing whine. A heavy thump echoed from the porch, followed immediately by a sharp, panicked scream that was cut short. The pry bar clattered against the wooden planks. "One down!" Imus grunted above her, jacking the lever of the rifle. The empty brass casing hit the floorboards with a bright ping. The scream acted like a tripwire. The tree line erupted in muzzle flashes. Heavy lead slugs tore through the cabin walls. The sound was terrifying, a chaotic, overlapping roar of gunfire tearing into the thick pine logs. The wood absorbed most of the impacts, but several rounds found the chinking punching through and burying themselves into the stove and the interior walls. Splinters the size of daggers rained down around Coraline. She threw herself flat on the mattress, covering her head with her arms, the Colt still gripped tightly in her right hand. The air filled with the sharp, sulphurous stench of black powder and pulverized wood. Amos fired twice more, the steady, rhythmic crack-lever-crack of his Winchester cutting through the chaotic barrage. "They're spread out," Amos yelled over the din. "Two in the trees, one moving left side." Coraline rolled off the cot, hitting the floor hard. She ignored the spike of pain in her ankle and dragged herself under the heavy oak table. The window shutter on the left wall took a direct hit from a large-caliber rifle. The wood splintered inward, a jagged hole appearing in the thick planks. A shaft of pale moonlight pierced the smoky darkness of the cabin. A shadow moved across the hole. Someone was standing right outside the window, pressing the barrel of a repeating rifle through the splintered gap. Coraline didn't think. She didn't calculate the moral weight of the action. Survival stripped away the luxury of hesitation. She raised the heavy Colt with both hands, bracing her elbows on the floorboards, lined the iron sights up with the dark mass in the window, and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her palms, kicking the barrel violently upward. The muzzle flash illuminated the room in a strobe of hellish orange light. The shadow at the window jerked backward with a wet, heavy grunt. The repeating rifle clattered to the floor inside the cabin, the man having dropped it as he fell backward into the snow. "Clear the window," Amos barked from above. Coraline scrambled backward, dragging her useless leg, pushing herself against the stone base of the fireplace. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had just shot a man. She looked at her trembling hands, half expecting to see blood on them. The gunfire from the tree line abruptly stopped. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. The ringing in Coraline's ears slowly faded, replaced by the howling of the mountain wind pushing through the bullet holes in the walls. Amos dropped down from the ceiling hatch, landing silently on the balls of his feet. He walked to the window, keeping his back flat against the wall, and peered through the bullet hole. "Two down," he muttered. The others fell back into the timber. "Are they gone?" Coraline asked, her voice trembling. Amos walked over to the table and picked up the scattergun. He looked down at her. In the dim moonlight cutting through the smoke, she could see a dark, wet stain spreading across the shoulder of his coat. "They aren't gone," he said, his voice tight. He touched his shoulder, bringing his hand away, covered in slick black blood. "They're just figuring out that the ledger isn't worth dying in the dark for. They'll wait for dawn." Coraline stared at the blood. Panic, sharp and cold, pierced through her adrenaline haze. "You're hit. Wood splinter. Caught me under the collarbone." Amos gritted his teeth, pulling his coat open. A jagged piece of pine 6 inches long was driven deep into the muscle just above his pectoral. He didn't ask for help. He gripped the bloody wood in his massive fist, took a sharp breath, and yanked it out. He threw the splinter on the floor. Blood immediately began to flow, freely soaking into his flannel shirt. Coraline pushed herself up on her good leg, grabbing the back of a chair for support. "Sit down. You're going to bleed out." "I've survived worse." "Sit down, Amos." It was a command, not a request. He looked at her, surprised by the raw authority in her voice. He slowly lowered himself onto the wooden stool. Coraline tore a long strip from the bottom of her ruined calico dress. She hobbled over to him, her hands moving with frantic efficiency. She wadded a piece of the fabric into a tight square and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound. Amos flinched, his jaw locking tight, but he didn't pull away. She wrapped the remaining fabric tightly around his shoulder and under his arm, tying it off in a hard knot. She stood close to him, smelling the cordite, the sweat, and the coppery tang of blood. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling against her hands. "You killed a man tonight," Amos said quietly, looking up at her. His grey eyes were intense, searching her face in the dark. "He was going to kill you," Coraline answered. Her voice didn't shake. "I do numbers, Amos. 2 of us against 4 of them was bad math. I just balanced the ledger." Amos let out a low, rough sound that might have been a laugh if his chest wasn't bleeding. He reached up and rested his heavy, calloused hand over hers, where it pressed against his shoulder. His skin was warm. "You're a terrifying woman, Coraline Lewis, and you're a stubborn fool, Amos Burnett." She didn't pull her hand away. "They'll come back at first light." "I know." Amos stood up, towering over her. He picked up the Winchester. He checked the magazine, topping it off with fresh cartridges. "But at first light I can see them, and they're going to realize very quickly that they picked the wrong mountain to climb." He walked to the heavy oak door. The pry bar had gouged the wood, but the iron deadbolt held firm. He dragged his heavy chest in front of the door, barricading it. "Rest," Amos said, nodding toward the cot. "Keep the Colt loaded. If I fall, you shoot whatever comes through that door, and you don't stop until the hammer clicks on empty." Coraline walked back to the bed. She didn't lie down. She sat on the edge, the revolver resting on her lap, watching the mountain man stand guard by the shattered window. The cold was bitter, the cabin smelled of gunpowder and blood, but as she watched his broad back silhouetted in the moonlight, she realized she had never felt safer in her entire life. Morning did not break. It bled. A pale, anemic light seeped through the bullet holes in the heavy oak shutters, casting long grey beams across the pulverized floorboards. The wind had finally died, leaving a brittle, frozen stillness in its wake. Inside the cabin, the cold was absolute. The water in the tin basin had frozen solid. Amos sat in the heavy wooden chair, his Winchester resting across his knees. He hadn't slept. His face was a mask of grey exhaustion, deeply etched with the lines of chronic pain. The rough bandage Coraline had tied around his shoulder was soaked dark, the blood dried and stiff. Every time he drew a breath, a faint, involuntary hiss escaped his teeth. Coraline sat on the edge of the cot, the Colt heavy in her lap. Her eyes felt like they were full of crushed glass. She watched the dust motes dance in the grey light, waiting for the inevitable roar of gunfire. It never came. "They're freezing!" Amos rasped, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. He slowly pushed himself up from the chair. His left arm hung uselessly at his side. City coats and riding boots. They spent the night in a snowbank at 10 degrees below zero. They aren't going to rush the door. They're waiting for us to come out. "Then we stay inside," Coraline said, her grip tightening on the revolver. "We don't have fire. We don't have water. We stay inside. We freeze just as fast as they do." Amos slung the rifle over his right shoulder. He walked to the chimney, looking up at the narrow ventilation hatch. "You hold the room. Lock the deadbolt behind me." "Amos, no. Your shoulder—" "My shoulder is meat." He didn't look at her. He didn't offer a comforting smile. He just stated the brutal arithmetic of the situation. "There are 2 men left out there with repeating rifles. If they figure out a way to spark a fire and throw it on the roof, we burn. I have to finish it." He dragged the wooden crate under the hatch. He climbed up, favoring his right side, his face tightening with agony as he hoisted himself through the narrow opening. The cold air rushed in, biting and sharp, and then he was gone. Coraline dragged herself to the door. She shoved the heavy iron deadbolt home, the loud clack echoing in the empty room. She pressed her back against the thick wood, sliding down until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting the barrel of the Colt on her kneecap. The silence stretched. It was a physical weight pressing against her eardrums. She counted her heartbeats. 100. 200. She strained to hear the crunch of snow, the snap of a twig, anything that would indicate what was happening out in the frozen timber. Nothing. Just the vast, indifferent quiet of the mountain. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The cold was beginning to seep through her heavy coat, settling into her bones. She began to shiver, violent tremors racking her body. Her broken ankle throbbed with a dull, sickening rhythm. A sharp, cracking sound shattered the quiet. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of a heavy branch snapping under immense weight. Coraline scrambled up, gripping the edge of the table, her eyes darting toward the splintered window shutter. Through the jagged hole she saw movement in the tree line. A man stumbled out of the deep snow. He wasn't aiming a rifle. He was holding his own throat. He wore a heavy canvas duster, the bottom hem frozen solid with ice. He staggered 3 steps into the clearing, his knees buckling, and collapsed face first into the snowdrift. He didn't move again. Amos stepped out from behind a massive ponderosa pine a moment later. He didn't have his rifle raised. He held a long, heavy hunting knife in his right hand. The blade was dark. He walked slowly toward the man he had shot off the porch the night before. He kicked the body over, retrieved the dropped repeating rifle from the snow, and slung it over his shoulder. He checked the tree line one last time, his gaze sweeping the perimeter with predatory focus. He stood there for a long time, the undisputed master of his brutal, frozen domain. Then he turned and walked towards the porch. "Open it!" His voice carried through the thick wood. Coraline threw the deadbolt back. She pulled the door open. Amos stood on the threshold. He looked terrible. His face was the color of ash. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the freezing temperature. The makeshift bandage under his coat was seeping fresh blood. He looked at Coraline, his grey eyes utterly hollowed out. "Where is the 4th man?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "Ran." Amos grunted, stepping inside. Found his tracks heading down the ridge. He realized the arithmetic was bad. He didn't make it to the chair. Amos took 2 steps into the cabin, his eyes rolling back, and collapsed. His massive frame hit the floorboards with a heavy, terrifying thud. Coraline dropped her crutch. She hit the ground next to him, her hands frantic as she tore his coat open. The wound had reopened completely. He had torn the muscle, climbing through the hatch and dragging himself through the snow. He was bleeding out. "Amos! Amos, look at me." He didn't move. His breathing was shallow, a ragged rattle in his chest. Coraline didn't panic. She had spent the last 24 hours marinating in terror, and there was simply none left. She dragged herself to the stove. She found the matches, struck one, and lit the kindling. She didn't care about the smoke anymore. She needed heat, and she needed boiling water. She worked with a grim, mechanical determination. She boiled snow. She tore the last clean sheets into strips. She packed the deep, jagged wound with a poultice of crushed pine needles and boiling water to cauterize the bleeding. Amos thrashed once, a blind, agonized groan escaping his lips, but he didn't wake. She bound his shoulder so tight her hands cramped. For 3 days she fought the fever. She sat beside his cot, wiping the sweat from his face with a damp cloth. She forced spoonfuls of warm broth past his lips. She tended the fire until her knuckles were black with soot. She watched the man who had carried her through a blizzard, the man who had stood between her and a bullet, fight a silent, invisible war in the dark. On the 4th morning, the fever broke. Amos opened his eyes. He looked at the log ceiling, then turned his head slowly. Coraline was asleep in the chair next to the bed, her head resting on her arms, the heavy Colt still sitting on the table beside her. He didn't speak. He just watched her breathe. The harsh lines of her face were softened in sleep, the cynical armor stripped away. He had saved her life because it was a reflex. She had saved his because she chose to. In the high mountains, that was the only currency that mattered. Spring did not arrive with a gentle breeze. It came as a violent rupture. The deep snowpack began to fracture and bleed, sending torrents of freezing, muddy water rushing down the ravines. The air smelled of wet earth, crushed pine needles, and the raw, aggressive push of new growth. It had been 6 weeks since the shootout. The bodies outside had long since been buried under cairns of heavy river stone. Coraline stood on the porch, leaning heavily on a carved wooden cane. The splints were gone. Her ankle still ached with a deep, persistent throb, and she walked with a pronounced limp, but she could bear her own weight. She watched Amos saddle 2 of the bay geldings the dead men had left behind in a makeshift rope corral down by the creek. He tightened the cinch on the lead horse, pulling the leather strap with his right arm. His left shoulder was stiff-scarred over with angry, knotted tissue, but the muscle had knitted back together. He tied the canvas saddlebags down. Inside the left bag was a change of clothes, a canteen, and a black Moroccan leather ledger. He led the horses up to the porch. Trail's mostly mud, but the pass is clear. Amos said, not looking at her. He kept his eyes on the horse's flank. It's a 2-day ride to the railhead at Silverbow. You can catch the eastbound out of there. Coraline gripped the railing. She looked at the cabin. She looked at the blood stains on the floorboards that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. She looked at the man holding the reins. And Josiah Taggart? She asked. There's a federal marshal's office in Silverbow. A man named Hatcher. He's straight. You hand him that book, Taggart won't have the reach to stop the warrant. Amos finally looked up at her. You have your leverage. You get your train ticket. You get to disappear. It was what she had fought for. It was why she had stolen the book, why she had nearly died in the snow, why she had shot a man in the dark. A clean slate in a city where no one knew her name. Right, Coraline said softly. She navigated the porch steps carefully. Amos held the horse steady, offering his good arm to help her into the saddle. His grip was firm, calloused, and familiar. She settled into the leather, adjusting her bad leg in the stirrup. The ride down the mountain was agonizingly slow. The transition from the pristine, brutal isolation of the high country to the muddy, sprawling reality of the valley was a physical shock. The air grew thicker, warmer, choked with the smell of coal smoke and raw sewage from the mining camps. By the afternoon of the second day, they rode into Silverbow. It was a boom town built on greed and timber. Men in bowler hats and mud-caked boots crowded the boardwalks. Saloon pianos pounded out frantic, tuneless rhythms. Every smile Coraline saw felt like a trap. Every friendly nod felt like a calculation. Amos hitched the horses in front of the brick building, bearing the wooden sign of the United States Marshal. I'll wait here, he said, stepping back onto the muddy street. He looked entirely out of place. A massive, scarred creature of the timber, standing amidst the fragile, noisy constructs of civilization. Coraline unbuckled the saddlebag. She pulled out the heavy black ledger. She looked at Amos. He gave her a single slow nod. She walked up the wooden steps and pushed through the glass door. 10 minutes later, she walked back out. Her hands were empty. The ledger was gone. Taggart's empire was a dead man walking. Amos untied the reins of her horse. Train station is at the end of the street. The eastbound leaves at 4. They walked in silence. The massive black iron locomotive sat idling on the tracks, hissing steam, a mechanical beast preparing to drag its cargo back to the polite, smiling world of the East. Passengers milled about the platform, adjusting fine coats, complaining about the dust, completely ignorant of the raw, bleeding edge of the world they were standing on. Amos stopped at the edge of the platform. He handed her the reins of the bay gelding. You can sell the horse to the livery across the street. It'll give you enough cash for a decent steak when you get to St. Louis. Coraline took the leather straps. She looked at the train. She listened to the conductor call for final boarding. She thought about the clean, quiet life waiting for her. A life of numbers, ledgers, and safe, predictable betrayals. She looked back at Amos. He was already turning away, his broad shoulders hunched against the noise of the crowd, preparing to walk back into the solitary silence of his mountain. "Amos!" she called out. He stopped, turning his head slightly. "You told me once." Coraline said, her voice clear, cutting through the hiss of the steam engine, "that down in the valleys men lie to your face and call it business, that you prefer the honest violence of the mountain." Amos turned to face her fully. His pale grey eyes were unreadable. "I did. I've spent my whole life in the valley," Coraline said, stepping off the wooden platform, her boots sinking into the mud of the street. She walked toward him, leaning on her cane. "I'm tired of the lying. I'm tired of the smiles." She stopped 3 feet away from him. The train whistle blew a deafening shriek of iron and steam. Coraline didn't flinch. She didn't look back at the train. She held the reins of her horse out toward him. "If I stay," she said, her chin raised, a fierce, uncompromising light in her dark eyes. "Who sorts the beans?" Amos stared at her. The noise of the boomtown, the hiss of the train, the shouting of the conductors, it all faded into white noise. He looked at the hard, beautiful, terrifying woman standing in the mud, a woman who had balanced his ledger with a single gunshot and dragged him back from the grave. A slow, rough smile broke across Amos's scarred face. It was a rare, startling thing, entirely genuine. He reached out and took the reins from her hand. "I reckon," Amos said, his voice a low rumble that settled the frantic beating of her heart. "We can find a way to split the work." They didn't look back as the train pulled out of the station. They turned the horses towards the bruised purple horizon, leaving the noise, the smoke, and the smiling violence behind. The journey up the mountain would be long, the winter would return, and the cold would always be waiting. But as they rode side by side into the deep timber, they carried their own fire. And this time, they were bringing it home together. Like this story, hit that like button, share this incredible journey of Amos and Coraline with your friends who love a gritty, authentic Western romance, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. We have many more thrilling, heart-wrenching stories of survival and love on the frontier coming your way. Drop a comment below. Would you have chosen the train or the mountain?